A question I'm asked every single day is how can one learn more about medicinal plants? People are learning, feeling overwhelmed. People are looking to a lot of perhaps guru-ish sources and or social media sources, and no one's immune. I actually have a lot of MDs ask me about learning further, and when I start to mention that it's a bit of a time investment, more than once someone has responded with, "Oh, just tell me some YouTube channels or YouTube videos to watch," and um, I don't really know any that I would recommend, except for maybe one or two on a very specific angle, which also aren't exactly learning how to use medicinal plants, although they might be really good for community building or for learning a specific angle, um, application style. But really, it's a bit more of a learning from videos online is a very disjointed way to learn about medicinal plants. So I'm not going to try to train you in medicinal plants over little videos, little YouTube videos, but I do really want to speak to some strategies, techniques, pitfalls, perhaps more kind of the ethos and the approach. Okay, so I really recommend that if you can and you're dedicated to learning medicinal plants, learn with and from someone who has at least a length of time in their life actually using medicinal plants. And ideally, actually, I think this is really big, they have learned from more than one person who also uses medicinal plants and learned from someone who uses them. Okay? And I don't mean in a self-discovery or self-healing way. I teach in a couple programs, and especially one of those programs, students often remark that a lot of the people they've maybe found online or blogs they're reading, that there's a lot of people who've come to alternative health through a self-healing journey. Um, I don't think that a self-healing journey archetype person is a good person to fully learn health, healing, or medicinal plants from. It is very compelling psychologically and does very well in marketing. It does well online. It does well, certain can be a certain personality quality that is attractive, but it is not often a good, replete, complete, comprehensive source of really building your approach to, let's say, a healing modality or, in my sort of expertise, medicinal plants. A person who has learned from, healing themselves, quote unquote, even if they have sought after many techniques, even if they're a medical doctor or a clinical therapist, those are all really good foundations, especially the second two there. When they're approaching a particular like alternative modality or medicinal plants, if their discovery and foundation of their knowledge is from self-healing, they can be really good at telling others about what worked for them. Okay? But foundational to holistic health and healing and use of medicinal plants is that individuals are going to respond differently. Okay? A plant is not, most plants that are safe to use are not as definite and one directional as medicinal drugs. So, a substance and a plant substance can become a medicinal drug if it is that bossy that across most of the population it will override certain physiological balances to produce a certain effect. And that's also not a beginner herb or a beginner substance, and that's why drugs are to be selected by medical professionals with a ton of training and assessment and a framework and an ethos and accountability to the use of those medications. And herbs are on this whole continuum from plants and use applications or uses of those plants that are going to be entirely safe for most people, and where billions of people have just learned the use of that plant household, but it goes all the way up in a gradual gradation to plants that are also as strong as or stronger than medicinal drugs, or contain, and are the origin of a compound that is a medicinal drug. Okay, but that's a bit of a big overarching tangent, but this is to say, you really, if you are dedicated to learning medicinal plants, you gotta be learning with or be coached by or guided by someone who has experience with actual use, okay? And they should ideally have learned in part by others who have actual use, okay? And I think that you have to start somewhere, but having more than one teacher is a good idea. And the reason for that is that each individual person puts their own spin on things, finds some things incredibly useful personally, finds some, philosophies or techniques for learning and remembering and applying plants. Each individual herbalist selects and favors different plants, different doses, and different approaches to, let's say, assessment differently. And so, especially if you're learning from just one, let's say, author, just one teacher who is incredibly popular, that popularity is a good testament to their way of being with people or their way of communicating their craft. But perhaps their approach may be a bit skewed, which can be reinforced by having a following and popularity. So it is really smart if you can learn from more than one person. Now, if you're just getting started in all this and it's overwhelming and your life is not going to allow you right now to travel to learn with someone, don't panic. Those are traveling to learn with someone in a safe and group environment is a very positive thing to do. But there are also lots of teachers who are online in a very robust way. And there are also lots of teachers who are authors. So I also am going to really caveat learning from books. There's a lot to gain from books, and I am a definite herbalist bibliophile. Most herbalists are. But a lot of books and herb books are set up in a way that they're a bit list-ish. There are bullet points, there are lists. And so what a lot of herb learners come away from those is a kind of a this for that approach. But also, if you look at some of those beginner herb books, or even comprehensive looking herb books, it may be that each plant has like 30 things that it is listed as being good for, and some of them might be names of diseases. But it might also be that if you're looking up something for a particular use, it might be that 30 different plants in that book are cross-listed with that use or that condition. And so now you're really in overwhelmed territory, and you're not actually finding, or you're not being guided to what is a certain plant's strong suit, or which of these 30 uses listed for a plant are the uses that practitioners actually still select these plants for, because they're effective in actual humans, and rate well with, in the scope of approaches that we have, including modern medicine and conventional just wisdom about health maintenance. Okay, so if you're learning along, with and from an herbalist who has practice experience, and perhaps their teachers had practice experience as well, which just kind of accelerates them a little bit and gives them some more context and a bit more guidance to begin with, then you can actually start to see which plants have actually worked for certain uses for actual humans, and which are, maybe robust and safe enough that they're still in use among the modern practitioners. Okay, so that's a big part of it. That's probably my main course takeaway for you. And I may be developing something down the road, a teaching offering. I have taught in a lot of capacities, typically under the structure of another school or teacher, which has been my way of doing it. I've also been entrepreneurial for 10 years, making herbal products of hundreds of different plants, about 300 different plants that I grew or gathered, and worked with the typically fresh herbal material, including, like I said, growing them, gathering them, and then actually sold these hand to hand with the end user or their, let's say, family member, household member. So that was a real rapid fire kind of interaction experience that I had, in addition to going to a clinical herbalist program, in addition to learning for several years with a teacher and practitioner who has many decades of experience, and his teacher had many decades of experience, and so on. And so, the takeaways are, yes, I may be offering something in the coming year, but also to learn in part from, or to get some exposure to learning with or from someone who actually is using plants and having conversations with individuals about their use of plants is really difference making compared to just learning from books. And also, the health journey folks and or the influencers online tend to be giving you an authoritative look at a narrow set of herbs or possibilities. Okay, so there is a real vast world out there. Sometimes what's the most popular in media is not something that, among my peers is really highly used. But that's also to say that their herbalism and medicinal plants are 100% cultural. Okay, so depending on our upbringing, where we have lived, our familial exposure, our prior interests, our peers, just which maybe herbalist was the first person we were exposed to, you're going to have different slants on what is a really useful plant, or what is maybe like what I call not my strong suit, which is to say that certainly that plant is probably entirely valid, and there are lots of plants that are like a panacea to particular cultural use, but not every herbalist is necessarily expert on every single plant. I don't think anyone could be. You can only sort of have exposure to many, and real experience with many. But there's just, I want to suggest, a nearly infinite array of what are medicinal plants and medicinal plant use. And even herbalism that perhaps in the West we don't necessarily call cultural is cultural, right? Like even, no matter what plant use you're talking about, it is culturally influenced, and opinions about it, ways of talking about it, ways of preparing the plant, whether you're making a tincture or you're doing soups or you're picking greens from the wild or growing them in your garden, whether you consider it a spice and or you consider it a, medicine, or you make a very sort of specific product of it, whether you use it singly or in combination, even just how you talk about your own use of plants, whether you say I'm an herbalist or you are a bit more humble about it. That's all culturally influenced. So there's room for all of it. I'm here for all of it, and learning from each other. Um, but I think sometimes, often, especially now that I think, um, people knowing about plants are a bit more kind of joining each other's and learning with and being exposed to each other's prior cultural experience. Sometimes one might be put off by or have an opinion of someone based on their knowing or not knowing about a particular medicinal plant. And it even happens sometimes when that person learned about that medicinal plant like a couple of months ago, right? But now it's sort of the litmus test for whether the person that they're talking to knows anything. So just realize there is such a broad scope to medicinal plants. We all can develop really, really great knowledge of use of particular things in particular contexts, but there's different contexts. They're studying something scientifically, which involves a particular type of approach and language. They're studying plants culturally. There's using them with other human people, and getting feedback about how or if that worked, and communicating to them maybe the how and why of why this plant is a good idea, the safety aspects to look out for. Some people will take medicinal plants and cultivate their first four and then maybe dozen that they trust like the ground. And still you might find somebody doesn't respond to it well. Others might go into using hundreds. Some people might be physicians and their knowledge of physiology and of safety is going to be really robust. But thinking and talking about medicinal plants is not quite the same, is not always the same, and is often not the same as thinking and talking about medicinal drugs. And so we all need a context of learning. No doctor learns in a vacuum just by themselves, reading books, and sort of downloading the information and practicing the skills. That the whole medical field is really a cultural context of peers guiding and leading each other in training for what is, in the medical practice, culturally acceptable and ethical, what in the our experience of using these medications is ethical and safe, what might get you into trouble, what might get your patient into real trouble, and a real kind of, indoctrination into not getting ahead of yourself. And I don't want to scare people from learning medicinal plants, but if you're coming from another field, any field, thinking that you're going to learn medicinal plants real quick, you can learn the safest ones today, but you can't learn it all real quick. And just as I would not expect a physician to train me immediately in the use of many drugs, I just wouldn't. That's a licensed, very protected type of practice. You need someone with some level of expertise or experience, let's say. Experience can be anyone, to guide you. That is a wise way to approach this, okay? You don't have to learn every plant from another person. Some are super safe, but an actual human person can be helpful in guiding that context, or when you have questions of how do plants rate with each other. So I'm going to let you in on one other thing, which is sometimes the plants that are pretty safe or very safe still come in the references with a long list of safety caveats. And sometimes the plants that are actually bad news poisonous, almost no herbalists, or even, it's very limited in traditional use and very specific, sometimes those in texts don't actually come with these flashing flags about safety, because it's almost like assumed maybe that people know that, or that it's not going to be actually used. So that is why learning with or from peers, users, etc., is really a good practice in whatever capacity you can access it. Okay.